Funding for this program provided by this station and other public television stations.
Since June 3rd of this year, a Mexican-owned and operated oil well in the Gulf of Mexico has spewed thousands of barrels of crude into the Gulf. All efforts to cap the runaway well have failed. Not even renowned oil firefighter Red Adair has been able to stem the constant flow of oil and natural gas. There is no telling if and when the well will be capped. Meanwhile, residents of the South Texas coast have lost millions of dollars in tourist revenues. Fishermen are wondering if the spill will damage future shrimp and redfish crops. Charges and countercharges over liability for damages have swelled print and broadcast news reports since August. Lawsuits have been lodged against the Mexican oil and drilling companies and against Sedco, the drilling contracting firm founded by Texas Governor Bill Clements. But throughout the entire episode, the frightening specter of future spills has been foremost in everybody's minds.
About our technology in this country, yes, we do have fine technology in this country. But let me state emphatically that there is no nation in the world that has the capabilities to deal with the amount of oil on the high seas that has impacted the Gulf of Mexico. The technology in the world is just not there. The best we can do is to hope to minimize the effects of the oil that does reach our continental shelf areas, our estuarine areas, and finally our shoreline. The best way to minimize damage in these kinds of instances, of course, is not to let them happen in the first place.
Despite the considerable damage caused by the spill, Mexican leaders have reason to rejoice. The vast quantities of oil escaping from the well confirm their belief that the Bay of Campeche holds unequaled hydrocarbon deposits. Officials now estimate that nearly 800 million barrels of crude lie beneath the damaged wellhead. Moreover, total proven reserves for the entire Bay of Campeche are now listed at over 10 billion barrels. For a nation that has faced severe economic conditions for many years, oil could provide a solid foundation for a secure future.
Queremos hacer del petróleo el eje
We want to make of oil the axis, the trigger
del desarrollo del país
for the development of the country.
a partir de los planes que nos permite la seguridad de disponer de energéticos.
Starting from the plans we have that make it possible for us to have energy available
Suficientes para nuestro desarrollo
for our
y
development,
sus excedentes para exportar.
and the surplus will be exported.
Con unos y otros tenemos la certidumbre de que los planes que estamos elaborando
On both of these points, we are certain that the plans we are drawing up
nos permitirán en los próximos años
will permit us in the following
resolver los
years
problemas básicos del país,
to solve the basic problems of the country,
fundamentalmente el desempleo.
basically unemployment.
Oil-dependent countries such as the United States and Japan are anxiously anticipating the continued development of the Mexican oil industry. Many feel that Mexico's huge reserves will buy the time needed to refine alternative energy sources. During the next 60 minutes, we'll look at the immediate effects of the blowout and Mexico's reaction to its newfound wealth.
Blowout, a special report.
Good evening, I'm Susan Wright. During the first days of the blowout disaster, news accounts from the well site were sketchy at best. Terse reports indicated that the runaway well called Ixtac-1 was one of 18 wells in the Bay of Campeche belonging to Pemex, Mexico's nationalized oil company. No one imagined that the blowout would be uncapable or that the resulting spill would become the largest ever recorded. Oil gushed from the ocean floor at the rate of 30,000 barrels a day. On June 27th, oil firefighter Red Adair and his crew managed to deactivate the flow from the well. An hour later, it blew out again. Adair immediately called for the drilling of 2 relief wells. These wells would intercept the crude and divert it to nearby tankers. Pemex officials cautioned, however, that the relief wells would not be in operation before early fall. In the meantime, 2 million barrels of crude could be expected to spill into the Gulf. In July, owners of the drilling rig presented a theory explaining the cause of the blowout. On June 3rd, the drill bit had actually penetrated a formation containing nearly 800 million barrels of oil. Once the bit hit this open space, the drilling mud used to send residue to the surface streamed out of the drill shaft. Drilling stopped immediately. After a period of time, workers on the rig started to withdraw the drill bit to assess the problem. As the withdrawal began, blowout stage 1 was reached. The drilling pipe was raised to the upper sections of the rig. The thicker drill collar was elevated to a height just above the surface of the water. Unfortunately, the drill collar was at the same level as the standard blowout protector, or BOP, when stage 2 began. 2 sections of the drill pipe had stuck together, and workers were unable to pull all of the pipe onto the rig. The remaining drill pipe started banging against the rig. The resulting sparks ignited natural gas that had flowed through the drill shaft to the surface. Normally, the blowout preventer would have sheared off the drilling pipe and stopped the flow of gas, but the preventer was not designed to cut pipe as thick as the drill collar. The fire raged out of control. The derrick started to melt down, and the spider deck ignited. Workers were forced to abandon the rig. The fire continued to spread, and the derrick completely melted away. The remaining pipe on the rig slid into the water, knocking the BOP out of line by about 10 degrees. Red Adair's efforts had failed because the preventer was out of skew. He was able to cap the top of the BOP, but within an hour the pressure grew so intense that oil and gas began to flow directly from the floor of the bay. Capping the gusher was now virtually impossible. Once Red Adair's efforts failed, grim reality set in. Oil was still spewing from the well at a rate of 30,000 barrels a day. Pemex officials were not only unable to cap the well, they were also unable to contain the northward flow of the spill.
On several occasions during this whole period of time, the National Response Team has gone on record through the Department of State to Mexico that we'd be happy to provide any assistance that we could. For a good while, Mexico used what they considered to be the best in industry versus the best in government approach. So we were not requested to participate in Mexico until fairly well on in the spill.
Captain Charles Corbett of the U.S. Coast Guard and Ken Bigling of the Environmental Protection Agency are co-chairmen of the National Response Team. The National Team is a policy-making body that responds to spills of oil and other hazardous materials.
When we decided that the oil, in fact, was going to reach the Texas coast, the pre-designated on-scene coordinator began to gear up for just such an occurrence. He identified equipment throughout the country, people that he might use in response to the spill, transportation corridors that he might use to get the equipment there, and so forth.
In this case, the pre-designated on-scene coordinator was Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Jim Paskowich.
The primary areas that the scientific assessment team determined had to be protected at all costs was essentially Laguna Madre. In other words, everything behind the barrier islands was very, very sensitive from an ecological viewpoint. That had to do with the estuaries, which they're really for spawning grounds for shrimp, which is a major industry in the state of Texas here. Many, many juvenile species are bred in Laguna Madre. There are also some very sensitive plant life there. And all indications showed that that was the area that had to be protected the most. And our response strategy then was to examine how we could best accomplish that. And what we found is that this type of beach in the Texas area is very hard-packed. And if oil did come ashore, the ecological damage in comparison with it landing on the beach was drastically less than if it showed up in these backwaters in Laguna Madre. Therefore, we decided that the best way to do it was to protect all the inlets. In other words, if we mobilized men and material and equipment to stop the oil from going through the inlets and allowed the oil to hit the beach and clean up the oil when it was on the beach as necessary, that would essentially would be the most productive from an environmental viewpoint and also financial viewpoint.
The Coast Guard strategy proved successful as far as the valuable spawning grounds are concerned. What little oil did seep past the barrier islands was cleaned up immediately. Other forms of wildlife in the area were only minimally disturbed.
Initially, the things we did notice was the fact that the bird life seemingly seemed to disappear. And this was pronounced in those birds that feed primarily along the swash zone, the sanderlings and the willets and these sorts of birds. we didn't know what happened to them. And we were worried that perhaps they may either have ingested oil or oily products or something, and perhaps they just disappeared. We found that apparently they began to disperse due to this oil covering to different other similar areas.
Bob Whistler is the chief naturalist at the Padre Island National Seashore. His office is responsible for protecting and maintaining the beaches and wildlife of the Padre Island National Park.
The impact on the invertebrates is something that is very subtle. There wasn't enough oil coverage for a long enough time that we feel that there was any impact there in any sort of substantial amount. We don't know yet, because this is still going on. There was some impact on some of the birds that feed out in the open Gulf. And because they feed out there, they were more prone to be affected by the oil, and were, than some of these other birds. Some of the blue-faced boobies and some of these other kinds of birds we found washed in that were covered with oil. And these were primarily the only ones that we had any problem with that were oil covered, and there wasn't too many of those. I would say there's perhaps about a half a dozen or so. And there was a Fish and Wildlife team and center established to take care of oil birds. So there was provisions made for this type of thing. So we didn't have the impact that we were really greatly concerned with in this regard.
But while the spawning grounds and wildlife were protected, the Padre Island beaches took a beating. On August 6th, large concentrations of tar balls began drifting ashore. On August 15th, oil slicks of varying size and density landed on the beaches.
The problem here is you have hundreds of miles of coast that you have to look at and protect and deploy equipment and try to clean up. So the magnitude of the problem is much, much more than just having an isolated area where once the event has happened, you go in, you clean it up, you boom it off or use some kind of devices to isolate it. But here it's completely different. You have an impact, you go, you clean that up, and maybe 2 days later, there's the same area you just cleaned is re-impacted. And those are the type of things you had to face. So for a while there, it looked like a never-ending battle.
The beaches of South Padre Island are prime tourist attractions. During a normal summer season, people from all over the world come to bask in the sun and drift in the warm Gulf waters. The tourist trade usually accounts for nearly $50 million in revenue. But this summer was different. Heavy concentrations of oil were present on South Padre beaches for only about 2 weeks in mid-August. Even so, negative publicity caused business to drop off severely long before the first slick washed ashore.
Tourism has been affected by virtue of the publicity of the oil spill because it's human nature. You don't want to take your vacation somewhere where it might not be as enjoyable as you thought it would be, or that it'll be spoiled by virtue of the beaches not being usable. I wouldn't want to go someplace and spend $100, $150 a day for my vacation with my family with the thought that we couldn't enjoy the facilities. And so mostly it's been fear that has affected the tourism down here, not the oil spill itself.
Whether it was fear or the actual presence of oil, the incident had a drastic impact on local business.
Business fell off as much as 70% of what it would have been. So I say we've lost certainly several millions of dollars in lost revenue as a direct result of the spill and the publicity.
I was running 45 trips a month, and I expected to run at least 30 in the month of September, and probably 40 in August, in which I did, I think, 15 trips in August and something like 5 or 6 in September. Fishing was good, but there wasn't nobody here to take.
We were down about 70% in August, 50% in September, and we're just now into October, so we don't really have any good figures yet. We're cut our hours back employees back. We're just more or less on a skeleton crew, just enough to man the place. We're spending all of our personal money trying to keep it going because I was determined not to close. And but it's if they don't do something quick, well, we're going to have to do something because I can't. You just finally run out of money.
The only type of financial help that has been offered so far is low-interest Small Business Administration loans. South Padre residents are quick to point out, however, that in most cases these loans just are not enough.
Here is a situation where people are simply borrowing more money to stay alive, money that's going to have to be repaid. It's just a matter of lower interest than they would ordinarily pay. The small businessman, it may be his salvation to carry him through, but he's still going to be faced with paying those monies back. And so I don't think it's certainly the answer in terms of what's needed here at South Padre Island.
An interest, all it is a cheaper interest rate and compared to commercial lending, and it could be maybe a $4,000 or $5,000 savings, all it would be in 1 year. And a loan is like anything else. You've got to pay it back. And so I'm really not out to borrow more money to pay back next year.
They told us that if there was any lag in it, that they would have people directly from Washington down here to help us, to expedite this thing, and they haven't done it. They've sent farm letters out, which they're treating it more like just a small business loan, not an economic disaster loan.
The lack of immediate help and attention from Washington has left many people on South Padre feeling like the federal government has forgotten them. Some think that the recent U.S.-Mexican oil sales negotiations are the reason for Washington's lack of support.
I kind of at times feel like I'm a pawn in the big game, so to speak. I have a feeling that they're skirting South Padre Island and the issue of the oil spill in order to get bigger fish. And as a result of it, I don't really expect to see any relief via President Carter or my federal government because they're negotiating with Mexico for energy. And I have a feeling we're going to probably just be passed up in the whole shuffle.
You can't hardly... Communicating with Washington is virtually impossible in the short term. We don't know what's going on with respect to our State Department and their State Department involving the gas and oil negotiations as it may have affected the oil spill. We're just not privileged to that, so we don't know. We probably feel that our problem was certainly not number one on the State Department's priority.
I think more or less the federal government is more interested in Mexico and their dealings with them than they are with us, because the only contact that we've had with the federal government in a way down here is the Small Business Administration and Senator Tower's office. They've had, or myself, have had no dealings with anyone else in the federal government.
Officials in Washington, however, feel like the federal government has done a lot to alleviate the problems caused by the spill. Robert Kruger is Ambassador-at-Large Designate for Mexican Affairs. He has participated in the sales negotiations for several months. He states that no type of trade-off was arranged.
I've participated ever since July in all of the discussions regarding natural gas that were underway between our governments. The question of the oil spill never at any time arose in any of those discussions. There was no sort of quid pro quo trade-off. We simply negotiated with them in a commercial transaction for the outlines of a natural gas agreement. What has been done on the federal level is, in the first instance, the federal government has spent something like $75,000 a day from using funds from the revolving fund in order to help cover cleanup costs. I think that's a significant amount. It is not an amount that covers all damages, perhaps, that might be brought, but there's probably no way of assessing all that in advance. In other cases, there is legislation that may be brought before the Congress to address specifically this concern and damages that individuals may have suffered because of this. We are dealing right now with the Justice Department and the legal section of the State Department to see what the options are for the U.S. government in terms, legally, what our options are in terms of addressing this question. But among other things, there is a deficiency, as I understand it, or a lack of any very extensive international existing body of law for questions of this kind.
This is not the first time that the United States has been involved with Mexico in a controversy of this kind. In the early 1960s, a serious problem concerning the quality of water flowing from the Colorado River into northern Mexican farmlands arose. This situation is now being used as the basis for Mexico's refusal to compensate Americans affected by the spill.
The problem began in 1961 when, by an unpredicted confluence of circumstances, the salinity of the water we were delivering to Mexico more than doubled. We were surprised, but Mexico, of course, was at the burden end and complained at once.
T.R. Martin is a special assistant in the State Department's Mexican Affairs Office. He is also acknowledged as the department's foremost expert on the Mexican-American salinity crisis.
It was our belief that agricultural drainage is not a contaminant under international law. Many agricultural areas were draining into the Colorado River, up and down the river. And secondly, because of the provision in the treaty that Colorado River water might come from any and all sources, we believed that the agricultural drainage was a legitimate source, and that hence this water was not being delivered contrary to the treaty, but rather that Mexico should accept it under the treaty. That began the problem.
The treaty of which Martin speaks was concluded by the United States and Mexico in 1944. According to the treaty, the U.S. is obligated to deliver to Mexico 1.5 million acre-feet of water a year from the Colorado River.
Mexico contended that it had a deleterious effect almost from the very beginning. And in the note of which it made, in which it made complaint about the quality of the water, it sought damages. We, of course, having denied the grounds for complaint, did not acknowledge our liability.
Mexico had to suffer grave damages in the Valley of Mexicali due to the actions taken on the Colorado River to wash the American soil with the same treaty of the waters that belong to us. I stress it. They used this water to wash the American soil. And as water included in the treaty, they delivered to us highly salinized water, which made the fertile Valley of Mexicali very salty. This implied two things for us. They simply transferred the salt from one side to the other, and they did not deliver usable water to us, as was foreseen in the treaty. When we made a claim, the United States refused to do anything about it. Now the situation has changed. It is possible that the oil that came out of this stock may have polluted some American coastline, and perhaps it caused some damage. In the first case, in Mexicali, we had reasons, but these were not turned into a right. In the case of the stock and the shoreline, there might be reasons, but there is also no right.
We're prepared to sit down and discuss these matters with Mexico. Mexico wants to sit down and discuss them with us on environmental questions. We're prepared to open them up, past as well as future, with the Mexican government.
We can solve any problem of this type in the future. That is what is desirable. But at the present moment, it does not seem desirable. It is undue and not dignified to assume that we are forced to Do something that our American friends did not wish to do when it was their turn. Right, after all, is a recognition of the golden rule. Don't ask from another something that you are not willing to give. It is very simple.
Now that the shoe is on the other foot, the State Department is virtually powerless as far as compensation is concerned. As a result, South Texas coast residents have had to fend for themselves.
We had no other alternative. We've tried to pursue every course of relief that we could think of, and everywhere we turned, we ran into a brick wall. And so the lawsuit was more of an act of frustration on our part, of something we needed to do, kind of like the last step. This was the last remedy we knew of, not necessarily the ideal remedy, the only one left to us. You know, the beaches have basically been cleaned within the town of South Padre Island. I think you all have seen that yourself. And so that part of it's over. And now what do we do to recover the economic damages that we've received? And the lawsuit's the only way I know of it, because Mexico isn't up here handing out checks. The federal government's not down here handing out checks. The state government's not down here handing out checks. The local town, of course, has suffered economic loss also, because as my business is hurt, so goes the town's revenue, because they collect their revenue from sales tax and hotel occupancy tax. In fact, their major source of revenue is from tourism, not from ad valorem tax. And everybody's been injured as a result of it in terms of economic losses.
The city of South Padre Island is one of the several interests that have filed intent to sue the companies involved with the drilling of Ixtac-1, Pemex, owner and operator of the well, Pamargo, the private Mexican company contracted by Pemex to drill the well, and Sedco, the oil rig leasing firm founded by Texas Governor Bill Clements some 30 years ago. But it is Sedco's actions which prompted the most controversy. Harry Hubbard, president of the Texas AFL-CIO, has stated that Sedco may be engaged in a cover-up. The union has indicated it will sue all three parties.
I think, and I think most other people believe that there has been an effort to cover up the liability of Sedco from the very beginning. And I said before, from the very beginning, the governor said, oh, you know, nothing to cry about, don't cry over spilled milk and all those kind of things. Most recently, I saw a quote in the paper where he was blaming the Attorney General and myself and probably the State Democratic Party chairman of trying to make a political issue out of a very, very serious disaster. So from the time it started until today, in the words of our governor, there was nothing to talk about. And now it's a very serious disaster. So I think it's very obvious. Why did they pull the rig out and sink it, you know, so early? Why did they go and while they were saying that we're not responsible, we're not liable, and get a limitation on liability and get a deadline on the date that anyone can sue for liability?
Following the blowout of the Ixtac-1, Sedco maintained that it was exempt from any liability. But subsequent events throughout the summer challenged the credibility of Sedco's claim. First, company officials authorized the disposal of the suspect rig in the waters 200 miles east of the well site. Next, doubts arose concerning the actual number of Sedco employees aboard the rig at the time of the blowout. And finally, in September, Sedco asked a Houston federal court to limit any liability that might be found to $300,000. By asking the court for this limitation, Sedco forced parties wanting to sue to file their intent to do so before the court-determined cutoff date of October 23, 1979.
So far as what prompted us to do it was that when Sedco went to court and limited liability, when they set a deadline is when suits could be filed, and then when they quietly drug their equipment out to past intercontinental shelf and sunk it so there wouldn't be any evidence, it was very obvious that someone had to do something.
Texas Attorney General Mark White has monitored the situation very closely all summer.
That was a decision that was made which at the first instance was suggested that due to the fact that the rig was so terribly damaged and was so unseaworthy that they sunk the rig. Later we discovered they pulled the rig the unseaworthy rig some 200 miles before they sunk it. And they sunk it in the very middle of the Gulf of Mexico. I thought this was an unusual decision.
The vessel was structurally damaged. It was structurally unsound. All of the drilling equipment had been lost and had fallen overboard. And the vessel was apparently a total loss the day after the fire occurred. However, our insurance underwriters and we ourselves sent surveyors and engineers and structural engineers down to the site, and all of these people boarded the unit and studied it and ran metal tests and discovered what equipment had been lost. And after a 2 or 3 week study thereafter, the conclusion was drawn by not only us but by independent parties and our insurance underwriters that the vessel had no value. And it was, in fact, a derelict wreck. And since it had no value, we were spending about $16,000 a day with 2 tugboats and personnel just standing by, making sure that it didn't get away, or make sure that if in the event that a tropical storm came through, that the vessel didn't break up in some fashion. We wanted to get rid of this liability. It was no longer an asset to anyone. It was merely a liability and a threat to navigation, and certainly a hazard if it did break up. It might run into another rig that was down there or run ashore, and it would be very expensive to remove. So the best thing for all parties was to take it out into very deep water where it could no longer be a hazard to anyone and sink it, which is what we did.
SEDCO has said we're not liable. In fact, they said in the beginning that they didn't have any employees on the rig. Then they had 3, and in the final analysis they had 7. So where does negotiations begin when you can't even get a straight answer out of the people that at least seemingly are responsible for it?
I think the analysis that we've done so far indicates that there's going to be fault to be found at every level. It seems that there's very suspicious things that have occurred. The first we learned was that there was no people from the SEDCO company on the drilling rig. The next thing we hear that there may be 3 or 4 there, and then it turns into 7.
I can probably take personal responsibility for that because back in early August, I was sitting in my office and received a telephone call from a newspaper reporter, and I've even forgotten which reporter it was, and he asked me how many men we had on board the SEDCO vessel that was involved in Mexico. And at that time, I honestly did not know how many, but I thought there were about 4. And I told him that there were about 4, but I wasn't sure exactly how many. And the next day he printed the story and printed it that it was exactly 4, and then other newspaper articles picked that up, and from then on it was exactly 4 until very soon thereafter we had a head count and determined that it was exactly 7. So that's how the discrepancy began.
I think certainly that there are so many unanswered questions as yet as to the condition of the rig, who had actual control over the rig, who was, there's also this delay for apparently 2 days almost, in which they were trying to make a decision on what to do about the loss of circulation in the well. All of these things and the decisions that were ultimately made, which have been disclaimed by SEDCO, SEDCO has certain responsibilities that overshadow the contractual relationships which they're trying to stand behind.
Our people on board were basically there to maintain our equipment. That was their basic charge, to be sure that our equipment was properly maintained and taken care of, and certainly they were there to be available to provide any assistance that might be asked of them in terms of advice or consultation. And that's primarily the role that they had there.
The city of South Padre made its intentions known shortly after SEDCO asked for the limitation of liability.
With the filing of that suit by SEDCO, then we could no longer sit and take no action. If the federal court established their liability at the $300,000 level, which is their request, obviously our losses are much greater than that. So The Board of Aldermen here felt that a suit was necessary to protect everybody's interest. We joined the suit involving Williston County, a class action suit whereby the city represents the classes of the government, be it navigation district, city, or whatever. That was filed approximately 3 weeks ago. The suit in numbers, as I can recall, was $100 million.
On Thursday, October 18th, Attorney General White announced the state of Texas is suing SEDCO and Camargo for $10 million in damages to the Texas ecology and for cleanup costs. Governor Clement's only reaction was to say, "I don't think his suit is good against anybody." The governor's response came as no surprise. Throughout the summer, he and White have clashed repeatedly over the advisability of suing the parties involved. The governor feels very strongly that the situation might be best handled by federal officials.
I have consistently and constantly and forevermore said, let's be quiet and let the State Department and the Foreign Ministry of Mexico negotiate. And all this chest thumping and talking about suing Mexico is not constructive and not helpful in that regard.
On August 9th, the governor said it would be inopportune for the state to sue Mexico over possible oil damage. The Attorney General maintained that this and other remarks made by the governor spoiled chances for out-of-court negotiations with Mexico. In short, he said the governor had taken away the state's trump card.
I think that was the whole reason for my request that he not continually repeat to officials in Mexico that Texas would not sue over an oil spill. This is simply not the way to engage negotiations over the payment of damages. I felt it was unfair both to the public of Mexico as well as to the people of Texas in the sense that misleading information should not be issued through an official source, and I think it directly resulted in positions that would not have been taken by Mexico.
Let me make one thing absolutely clear to you and everybody else. By the Texas Constitution, I am the Chief Executive Officer of the state of Texas, and the Attorney General is my counselor or my lawyer, so to speak. I have been in the business environment now for some 40 years as Chief Executive Officer of an enterprise, and I reserve the right as Chief Executive Officer to express my opinion on any subject that I deem appropriate for me to have an opinion. And I also reserve the right to take the advice or not take the advice of my lawyer. That's what a lawyer is for, is to give advice. The Chief Executive Officer is in his office to make decisions. And so when I decide that I will either accept his opinions and agree with him, I'll say so. And when I don't accept his opinions and his advice and I don't agree with him, I reserve the right to say so. So, you know, I'm not going to be in default on that to him or anybody else.
Many people speculate that the governor's reaction is motivated in part by his connections with SEDCO. Before his election, the governor was president and chief executive officer of the drilling firm. The company is currently headed by his son, Gil.
When I divorced myself from the company that I founded, actually over 30 years ago, and had always been the chief executive of that company, when I left the company and put my stock in a blind trust and resigned, I did it totally. And it's not the sort of thing that you can dip in and dip out of. People don't seem to understand that. It's kind of like a surgeon that get halfway through an operation and leave and go off and play golf or do something else and then come back a week later and say, well, I'm going to take up the operation again. You can't do that. And so I don't have anything to do with the operation of the company, and I don't know what they're doing, and I don't know how they're doing it. And I really am not interested.
After Governor Clement had made his trip to the South Texas coast to investigate personally, he came to the office here one day. He happened to be in town and came by here, and I was in a meeting with him with 3 or 4 other people for about 10 or 15 minutes, and most of that time was really spent talking about what we understood to be Pemex's plans to put the funnel or the cone over the well to stop the flow of the oil onto the surface of the ocean. But that was the only meeting I've had with him in connection with this matter.
Perhaps the greatest lesson from this experience is that the United States and Mexico need to formulate an agreement to prevent future misunderstandings. Offshore blowouts are nothing new. Mexico has indicated it intends to pursue a rigorous hydrocarbon development program in the Bay of Campeche. The probability of future spills in southern Gulf waters will increase proportionately.
There's no nation absolutely capable of cleaning up absolutely all oil spilled on the high seas in the quantities that we saw in the Gulf of Mexico. We encourage the use of the planning mechanism to address large and impactive spills with adjoining nations. Again, it reinforces our belief that a planning mode is most essential if one is to make any sense at all out of protecting the environment following one of these large spills.
It's my understanding that we first approached Mexico several years ago, suggesting that two countries might try to work out a treaty and doing something of this kind. We presented language to the Mexican government, I am told, in April of 1978 as initial language that we would propose for a treaty between the two countries. We have not, to my knowledge, as yet heard from them.
We are willing to agree on future cases in order that both countries may be obligated to take preventive measures to correct damage whenever this should occur, and to have systems which would formalize and ways of making the claim.
The amount of Mexico's oil reserves is staggering. Figures for proven, probable, and potential reserves are constantly on the increase.
Our last expression of reserves was made by Mr. López Portillo in his presidential speech of the 1st of September of this year, and we have 45 billion of proven reserves, 45 billion of probable reserves, and 200 billion of potential reserves.
Jorge Diaz-Serrano is Director General of Pemex. He explains how Mexico's oil development prospects have changed since December 1976.
What we had in those days was a tremendous expansion program. From 6 billion, we were expanding our reserves to 11 billion in that particular month. And we announced that we were going to reach a production from 900,000 barrels per day that we had to 2.25 million, 2,250,000 barrels per day in 1982. We started our program. We found the geology and the discoveries more, let's say, abundant or more prolific. And we decided to expand further our program by bringing the production of 1982 to 1980.
While Mexico's oil industry has progressed more swiftly than perhaps even he had imagined, President López Portillo has been careful not to minimize his country's other resources.
We don't want to turn oil into the factotum of our development, but to use it as a sort of trigger for our development. Fortunately, the country has sufficient conditions that lead us to think that this is possible. We have other very important raw materials. We have an interesting market. We have a population that has well-trained sectors to face these, and we have confidence in ourselves. The country in previous times had an acceptable rate of development based on oil sufficiency. This decreased in the years 73 and 74 when we were forced to import. I believe we have sufficient conditions in order to make it possible to organize, starting with petroleum, but not to depend on it. And to think early about a substitute of this source of energy, which is non-renewable. We believe that this is as good for the country as it is for all humanity. We are a frontier generation. We are now between two systems of energy. We must be very much aware of this, so as not to leave an unresolvable problem for our children.
The average Mexican citizen has heard much about the benefits oil can bring, but only a small percentage of the population has actually witnessed any immediate effects. President Lopez Portillo is determined to stabilize his country's soaring rate of inflation. The president is quick to recognize that too much oil-related revenue will only worsen his country's economy.
We believe that it is not the reserves that must lead the exploitation within a national system, but the capacity the country has to invest and to exploit oil, and once the investment has been made, we will only export as much as the country's economy is able to digest, so as not to bring about the worst sort of inflation due to a financial congestion, which would force a country that has such serious lacks as ours has to paradoxically have to export capital.
Estamos pues adecuando nuestra explotación del petróleo a nuestra capacidad económica.
Our oil exploitation to our economic ability.
Por esta razón estamos fijando lo que llamamos plataformas de explotación.
For this reason, we are establishing what we call exploitation platform.
A principios de nuestro régimen,
at the beginning of the regime,
nos fijamos en llegar para 1972 a una plataforma
to reach a certain level or platform by 1982 of around 2,200,000 barrels per day. This might increase a little.
Esta meta la estamos logrando para 1980.
This goal will be achieved by 1980.
Y ya que estemos en ella, resolveremos con vista de la situación de nuestra economía.
And when we arrive there, then, with a view to the present, to the economy we have then, we will see what the next step shall be.
Estamos muy atentos a nuestra economía y a su contexto mundial.
We are taking great care of our economy in its world context.
Ha habido pues un cambio total.
There has been a total change.
No son las reservas las que mandan la explotación.
It is not the reserves that lead the exploitation,
no, la conveniencia nacional,
but the desirability that is due to the economy of the country.
Because of its abundant oil and natural gas supplies, the Mexican government's responsibilities extend beyond its own borders. Developed and underdeveloped countries now look to Mexico for help in solving their energy needs.
Recientemente hemos propuesto a las Naciones Unidas.
We have recently proposed at the United Nations the desirability of a world plan for fuel,
en el que se consideran las necesidades de todos los países, no solo de los poderosos grandes consumidores.
Where the needs of all countries are considered, not only of the large countries, the big consumers.
Todos tienen necesidades energéticas.
All need energy.
Pero no queremos deformaciones de este tipo.
But we do not want to have deformations of this type,
solo acelerarían el desorden.
which would only accelerate disorder.
Si vamos a considerar necesidades ajenas,
if we are going to consider the needs of others,
lo razonable es que las consideremos dentro de un orden.
It would be reasonable to consider them within a certain order,
para aumentar el desorden.
And not merely to increase the disorder.
Por esta razón nosotros entendemos muy bien cuáles son las necesidades energéticas de los Estados Unidos.
We understand very well the needs that the United States has for fuel.
Como entendemos las necesidades energéticas de Nicaragua y Costa Rica, que son pequeños países.
Understand the needs of Nicaragua and Costa Rica, which are small countries.
Y que están en una relación comparativa muy desfavorable.
In a very unfavorable comparative position.
Nosotros quisiéramos que la humanidad entendiera la necesidad
We would like all humanity to understand the need
de ordenar el tránsito de una época energética a otra época
of
energética.
ordering the passage of going from one fuel time or period to another.
Ordenando y racionalizando tanto la exploración
Ordering and rationalizing not
como la
only the
explotación,
exploration but exploitation,
la distribución
the distribution
y el consumo de los
and
energéticos actuales, fundamentalmente petróleo.
of the present day sources of energy, basically oil.
President Lopez Portillo also recognizes that the United States is aware of Mexico's burgeoning influence.
Claro, cambian las condiciones.
Naturally, conditions change
Porque la posición de México se ha modificado
because Mexico's position has changed
en función de que tiene algo ahora
in view of the
que
fact
interesa
that
sustancialmente.
it now has something that substantially interests the United States.
Well, I think that we have a changing relationship in our relations with Mexico. And that relationship is changing in part because Mexico is now the 11th largest country in the world. Mexico is taking an increasingly important role internationally, certainly in this hemisphere, but actually throughout the world. And during a time of a changing relationship, there are sometimes some growing pains in that relationship. I think it is to the U.S. advantage to have strong neighbors, and I think that the increased strength from Mexico is something we ought to be pleased about. It doesn't necessarily make it easier in a time of transition, but I think it's important for the future.
Lo que yo les quiero decir es que sí quisiéramos
What I would like to say is that we would very much like
una relación más equilibrada
to have a more balanced relationship
con los Estados Unidos,
with the United States
de modo tal que se resolvieran
so that
una serie de problemas que
we could
tenemos
solve a number of problems we have,
y que tienen distintas expresiones según las épocas.
which are expressed differently in accordance with the time in which they are
Definitivamente a México
expressed.
le gustaría ser menos dependiente de los Estados Unidos,
I would definitely like to be less dependent on the United
con
States,
el mismo título que, por ejemplo, Estados Unidos
and the United States perhaps
quisiera ser menos dependiente de la OPEC,
would like to depend less on OPEC,
mientras un país dependa más de sí mismo,
while as long as the country depends more on itself,
está en mejor condición.
it will be in a better situation.
Pero creo que debemos contemplar
But I believe
la
we should
relación con Estados
contemplate
Unidos
the relationship with the
en
United
función
States
de un equilibrio respetuoso
as being a respectful balance
y una ampliación de nuestra relación con el resto del
and
mundo,
a broadening of our relationship with the rest of the world,
reconociendo siempre el imperativo de la geografía.
always recognizing the force of geography.
Hay una lógica geográfica.
There is a geographic logic.
Es evidente que entre dos vecinos
It
con
is
3.000 kilómetros de frontera
evident that between two neighbors with a borderline of 2,000
y
kilometers
economías complementarias
and complementary economies,
deben encontrarse las fórmulas
the formulas must be found
que
to
significa
flow
justicia y explotación,
so as to have justice without exploitation,
que pasemos de un sistema a otro más amplio.
that we would go from one system to another one which is broader and more understanding, more comprehensive.
It should be noted that throughout the entire blowout incident, natural gas sales negotiations between Mexico and the United States went on without interruption. The two countries concluded a deal this past September. The first supplies of Mexican gas should reach the United States on January 1st of 1980. As far as the blowout is concerned, oil continues to spew from the ruptured well. The total volume of the spill is said to be near 2.5 million barrels, but Pemex officials may have found a way to substantially reduce the flow. On the morning of Monday, October 15th, a massive steel cone was placed over the well. The cone, or sombrero as it's called, weighs 310 tons and is 35 by 65 feet in size. The sombrero collects crude oil, gas, and seawater. The mixture is fed into a triangular surface platform equipped with a separator to burn off the gas. The oil and seawater are then separated and the crude is pumped into waiting tankers. A spokesman for Pemex says 85% of the gas should be controlled by the cone, but the other 15% could continue to spill into the ocean. The sombrero is, of course, only an intermediate solution. Work is continuing on the two relief wells. Crews are still feeding lead and iron balls into Ixtoc 1. If and when these balls stem the flow, the well could then be sealed with cement. One final footnote. Court officials expect more suits to be filed before the October 23rd deadline. Joe Jamail, lawyer for a group of commercial fishermen, estimates that court proceedings could start by the end of 1980. The jeopardy posed by the runaway well has all but passed, but its repercussions will be heard well into 1980 and maybe beyond. I'm Susan Wright. Good night.
The environment, in a sense, is what we sell. In order to have a place for the people of Texas to come to vacation and to enjoy the beach, we've got to keep the environment in such a manner that this is inviting to the people of Texas and to the Midwest, as a matter of fact.
And this becomes I'm worried right now about the amount of oil that's out there still floating around somewhere. Nobody's yet told me for sure where it is or what happened to it. I'm concerned that it may come in with the next storm surge.
We locally, there was nothing we could do but sit and wait, and that added to the frustration, knowing that it was out there, not knowing if or when it was coming, how severe it would be. And I think that's still the mood here to a great extent, because the well has not at this point in time been capped. If it continues to spill, who knows what might happen next spring when conditions change, the currents and the winds could conceivably bring that oil back.
We're worried about the nursery grounds, and so far it looks like they've been protected. Our attitude right now is to wait and see what happens when our shrimp start to spawn later on this year or early next year, and if there's no oil out there that will kill them before they come into the nursery areas.
I was saddened because I moved to the coast in the South Padre Island because of the beautiful beaches, and it was a very horrible sight to see a beach that looked like it was blacktop. I wasn't really mad. I guess in a way I was, but I didn't have any anger. It was just a situation that we wish it hadn't happened, but it happened. And
this idea, the thought of what are we going to do, and not knowing just exactly what to do, and not knowing how it was going to affect and how long it was going to affect, these sort of things was what I guess bothered me most.
Funding for this program provided by this station and other public television stations.